Good morning. Welcome to worship this Sunday. I'd like to welcome those joining us online as well. It's good to be together in this fourth Sunday after Easter. And today we're going to be continuing the Easter sermon series about kind of the ripple effects of resurrection. And today's topic will be freedom from the power of fear. A lot of ways to think about fear. We know a lot of ways fear affects us. And I'll be listening to some passages about that. We'll hear one from Luke. You got some allusions to the value of sparrows, kind of that, and related to how we think about God and God's care of us, and then a great passage in 1 Corinthians that will be kind of the basis for my sermon today. So that will be the theme, and as always, we'll have more announcements later. Just want to welcome you to worship, and it's good to be together today. There's a pilgrimage site in northern Lithuania that started sometime in the mid-1800s. And under the Russian Empire, there was this series of uprisings by people in many villages there who obviously had problems with the power of the Russian Empire. And there would be these uprisings from time to time. The empire was quick to put them down and disappear people. And when families couldn't find the bodies of their loved ones who had rebelled, they started erecting these crosses on a hill nearby. That hill was a site of an old fort. And eventually, that hill became a gathering place where people would go to remember their loved ones who they couldn't find anymore. And during Lithuanian independence in World War I, that became a significant place to remember the people who had fought. It became a place to honor veterans and ones who had died as well. Well, when the Soviet Union really came to power, the church, as a religious institution, was considered a threat. They were considered to have a subversive message to the empire. So people would bring signs. They would bring crosses to this hill as a sign of protest against government censorship. And thus began this kind of back and forth. The government would place limits there on the crosses that could be put up. They had to have a certain aesthetic. Or the government would just bulldoze all the crosses there, and then more crosses would be brought. They tried to limit access to the hill. They put guards up at the hill. They arrested people who they found trying to put crosses in there, but by morning, the crosses would always come back. At the fall of the Soviet Union, that ended that kind of back and forth of the crosses. And since the 90s, more and more crosses have been added. It's estimated that there are over 100,000 crosses on this hill. This is a story of resistance and endurance, but it's also a story of competing power. And I mentioned the topic that I wanted to get into this week in my Easter series is freedom from the power of fear. And it occurred to me while I was preparing for this that I could easily flip that title around as well, that it could be freedom from the fear of power. When talking about the resurrection of Jesus, I don't know how I can talk about it faithfully without addressing the issue of power, especially how we can understand God's power. And that's the part that I want to focus on this week. There's a little bit of dovetailing between this week and next week. Next week's topic will be the dynamic of the resurrection in a world of danger. Both are kind of about power there, but we're going to look at God in particular this week. And there's lots of fear of God in the scriptures. The people are told to have a fear of God, so that's there. But it shows up in other ways as well, that God is this other, this holy that we're to fear, But what kind of fear is it? It's more holding God in awe rather than an actual be afraid. The prophet still had lots of warnings about the people being in danger of God's anger, of God's wrath. There was this idea that punishment would come upon them as a result of their sin, and that punishment would be attributed to God. There's this fear of judgment, of course, that comes about in the New Testament as well. We have this image here of Jesus coming at the end of time as judge, right? Like that's definitely prevalent there. I want to take a little bit of time in Luke because that passage in Luke, we have Jesus offering this pretty dramatic warning about who to fear. Jesus tells his disciples that they shouldn't fear the powers of this world, but the one they should fear the one who, after killing, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, fear that one. And he's being a little tongue-in-cheek here, because the idea is no one who kills has the power to cast into hell, right? But the implication here is that there's this cosmology. There's an assumption that there will be judgment, that there will be a hell. That I have more thoughts on that. That's for another sermon altogether. But somewhere along the way, we develop this picture. We have this picture of God and how God's power works. That when we reach the end of time, the end of everything, that there will be this time of judgment, right? When we reach the end, if you are not on board with what God is doing, you better watch out. While I believe in the value of humility, there is a problem that I have with this assumption about divine power. And my problem is that it ignores what Jesus showed us about who God is. And what the resurrection showed us about God's desire for our future. Not just our future, but the future of all of creation. We could look at that story of the Hill of Crosses in Lithuania and see it as this story of a battle, this great battle between good and evil. And some see the story of Jesus as that, as this grand battle between good and evil. But it's not just about dueling powers, one power that has righteous aims, the other power that has evil aims, but at its core, the cross of Christ and the resurrection reveal that God's power is of a different kind altogether. God's power is about transforming the coercive powers of fear that prevail in our world. Now, these powers look very similar at first, and I think that reveals the limitations of our language. So looking at what Paul shared in that letter to the Corinthians here, Paul explains that what Jesus' resurrection ultimately means. That at the end of time, there'll be this return of Jesus. Jesus comes back. Then, after the resurrection of God's people, Jesus hands over all power to God. At the end, you have this image of Jesus putting all things under his feet. And after every ruler, every power is destroyed, death is the very last enemy to be destroyed, and he's handing everything over to God. You have that image there of kind of the flower. I don't know if it's not really an olive branch. I think that's a lily there, and the sword on one side. And it's which is Jesus going to grab? Because he could grab both, right? Now, it's natural for us to read this language of Jesus subduing the enemies, Jesus destroying death, as conquering language. And it's true, it's there, but it's of a different kind. See, in this world, coercive power rules the day, and we're mistaken if we think that God ultimately chooses that kind of coercive power. Where coercive power gets its hooks in us is by this threat of punishment and judgment. But we know the limitations of that kind of power, don't we? What parent doesn't know the limits of coercive power? You don't even need to have been a parent. You just had to have been parented. Not even by biological parents, but older adults, right? Anytime there's a prohibition that's enacted on a behavior, well, what's the first thing that you want to do? You want to test that, right? Our curiosity gets to work, trying to undo that prohibition, trying to find some holes in there and a way through. And in that way, we learn to kind of respect power, right? Especially when there may be a threat. There may be something to fear at the end of it. What if instead, though, we can understand God's power in Christ as this subversive protest? A protest against coercive power that counters any insatiable powers of this world with solidarity with the ones who suffer, with unrelenting love. Because if there's no resurrection, then death has not been destroyed after all. Well, the image that we're often left with is this image of a militant Christ who stands among the vanquished enemies on this great battlefield at the end of time, right? And I'll be honest, that image sounds good, knowing that there's no more fear of anything else, fear of evil, all that is gone. But God works in a very different way to accomplish God's ends, and I don't know exactly what it looks like, so I can't lay out the playbook for you, but at the end of this passage here, or actually more in the middle of Paul's argument here that's rather thick. Why does Jesus do all this reigning, all this subduing of powers, handing everything over to God, destroying death? It's so that God may be all in all. Another version of this that I really appreciate is that this means that God is making all things in harmony with God's self. Now that looks like a very different, that has to be a power that works very differently than what we think a dominating power looks like. Theologian who I really appreciate, Tripp Fuller, makes this case that this language here in 1 Corinthians is not God's coercive power taking over all other powers. Instead, it's part of this resurrection fulfillment. And it's this fulfillment where every distorted relationship is finally healed. Every wound finally received into divine love, and every cross-dead person is finally home. It's this image of fear being subverted. And how does this land for us today? I did some reflecting on that, how that lands in our current climate. And I think right now Christians are very divided on divine power. I would even go as far to say as we are facing this theological crisis. This crisis that's bleeding over into society. Twice in the past week I saw vehicles with this bumper sticker. There's obviously this fear that people have for what kind of power Christians desire, what kind of power they want to see happening, spread in our country. And there's this warning here, I think, for us. Again, going with that theologian Tripp Fuller, he makes this important observation, I think. The community that worships a God of coercive omnipotence will, consciously or not, reach for coercive solutions when it feels threatened enough. To be a people of resurrection, we better represent God's power faithfully. Not because there is this or else that we need to worry about, but for the sake of truth. For the sake of living as Jesus wanted us to live. And I want to encourage you to explore the small but meaningful ways that you can choose to reject coercive power. What are those hills that you can place a cross at? Where placing that cross means that we're committing to that subversive power of Christ's love. That love which is bringing all things into God's self in God's own time. This, I think, is our consistent challenge and invitation. To be steadfast in our commitment to the love that resists the coercive powers of this world. The powers that look so easy to take, so tempting. But our commitment leads us to find an enduring power that is proclaimed in Jesus' cross and that still flows out from the tomb. May God give you strength, encouragement as you try to find this power in your life.